Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift. Travels Part 2. A Voyage to Brobdingnag. Chapter 1. A great storm described. A long boat sent to fetch water. The author goes with it to discover the country. He is left on shore, and seized by one of its natives, and carried to a farmer's house. His reception there, with several accidents that happened there. A description of the inhabitants. Having condemned by nature and fortune to an active and restless life, in 10 months after my return, I left my native country and took shipping in the Downs of the 20th day of June, 1702. In the adventure, Captain John Nicholas is a Cornish man, commander, bound for Surat. We have a very prosperous gale till we arrived at the Cape of a Good Hope. We landed for fresh water, but discovering a leak, we unshipped our goods, and wintered there, for Captain falling sick of an ague. We did not leave the Cape till the end of March. We then set sail, and had a good voyage, till we passed the Strait of Madagascar. But having got northwards of that island, we are about 5 degrees south latitude. The winds, which in those seas are observed to blow a constant equal gale between the north and west of the beginning of December till the beginning of May, on the 19th of April began to blow with much greater violence, more westerly than usual, continuing so for 20 days together, during which time we were driven a little to the east, in Molucca Islands, about 3 degrees northwards of the line, as our captain found by an observation he took the 2nd of May, at which time the wind ceased, and it was a perfect calm, whereat I was not a little rejoiced, but he, being a man well experienced in navigation of those seas, bid us all prepare against the storm, which accordingly happened the day following, for a southern wind, called the southern monsoon, began to set in. Finding it was like to overblow, we took our spritsail, and stood by to hand the foresail, but making full weather, we looked the guns were all fast, and handed the mizen. The ship laid very broad off, so we thought it would be better spooning before the sea than trying or hulling. We reefed the foresail and set him. We hauled aft the foresheet. The helm was hard as a wither. The ship wore bravely. We belayed the fore down haul, but the sail was split, and we hauled down the yard, and got the ship into the ship, and unbound all the things clear of it. It was a very fierce storm. The seas broke strange and dangerous. We hauled off the lanyard of the whipstaff, and helped men at helm. We would not get down our topmast, but let all stand, because he scudded before the sea very well, and we knew that the topmast being aloft, the ship was the wholesomer, and made better way for the sea. Seeing we had sea room, the storm was over, and we set foresail and mainsail, and brought the ship to. We then set the mizen, the main topsail and the foretopsail. Of our course was east-northeast, and the wind was at southeast. We got the starboard tacks aboard. We cast off our weather braces and lists. We set in the lee braces, and hauled forward by the weather bowlings, and hauled them tight, and belayed them. The hauled over the mizzen tackle to windward, and kept her full, as by near she would lie. During this storm, which was followed by a strong wind west-southwest, we were carried, by my computation, about 500 leagues to the east, so that the oldest sailor on board could not tell in what part of the world we were. Our provisions held out well, our ship was staunch, and our crew all in good health, but we all lay in the utmost distress for water. We thought it best to hold the same course rather than turn more northly, which might have brought us to the northwest parts of the great Tartary, into the frozen sea. On the 16th day of June, a buoy on the topmast discovered land. On the 17th, we came in full view of the great island, or continent, for we knew not whither, the south side whereof was a small neck of land, jutting out into the sea, in a creek too shallow to hold a ship in above 100 tons. We cast anchor within a league of this creek. Our captain sent a dozen of his men well armed into the long bolt, with vessels for water if any could be found. I desired his leave to go with him, and that I might see the country, and make discoveries of what I could. When we came to the land, we saw no river, no spring, nor any sign of inhabitants. Our men therefore wandered on the shore, to find out some fresh water near the sea, and I walked alone about a mile on the other side, where I observed the country all barren and rocky. I now began to be weary, and seeing nothing to entertain my curiosity, I returned gently down the creek, the sea being full in my view. I saw our men already got into the boat, and rowing for life to the ship. I was going to hollow after them, although it had little purpose, when I saw a huge creature walking after them in the sea, as fast as he could. He waded not much deeper to his knees, and took prodigious strides. Our men had the start of him half a league. In the sea there about half full sharp pointed rocks. The monster was not able to overtake the boat. This I was afterward told, but I durst not stay for the issue adventure, but ran as fast as I could the way I first went, and climbed up a steep hill, which gave me some prospect of the country. I found it fully cultivated. That which first surprised me was the length of the grass, in which those grounds seemed to be kept for hay, was about 20 foot high. I fell into a high road, for so I took to be, though it served to the inhabitants only a footpath through a field of barley. Here I walked on for some time, but I could see little on the other side. It seemed now near harvest, and the corn rising at least 40 foot. I was an hour walking to the end of this field, which was fenced in with a hedge of at least 120 foot high, and the trees so lofty that I made no computation of their altitude. There was a stile to pass of this cornfield into the next. It had 4 steps of stone to cross over, and when you came to the uppermost, it was impossible for me to climb the stile, because every step was 6 foot high, and this upper stone above 20. I was endeavouring to find some gap in the hedge, when I discovered one of the inhabitants in the next field advancing towards the stile, of the same side with him whom I saw in the sea, pursuing our boat. He appeared as tall as ordinary spiral steeple, and took about 10 yards at every stride. As near as I could guess, I was struck with the utmost fear and astonishment. I ran to hide myself in the corn, from whence I saw him at the top of the steele, looking back into the next field on the right hand, and heard him calling in a voice many degrees louder than a speaking trumpet. But the noise was so high in the air that at first I thought certainly it was thunder, whereupon 7 monsters like himself came towards with reaping hooks in their hand, each hook about the largeness of 6 scythes. These people were not so well clad as the first, whose servants or labourers they seemed to be, for, upon some words he spoke, they reaped into the cornfield where I lay. I kept from them at a great distance I could, but was forced to move at extreme with difficulty, for the stalks of the corn were sometimes not above a foot distant, so that I could hardly squeeze my body betwixt them. However, I made a shift to go forward, till I came to a part of the field where the corn had been laid on the rain and wind. Here it was impossible for me to advance a step, for the stalks were so interwoven that I could not advance the step, or creep through, and the beards of the fallen ears were so strong that pointed that they pierced through my clothes into my flesh, and at the same time I heard the reapers not above 100 yards behind me, quite being dispirited with toil, and wholly overcome by grief and despair. I lay down between 2 ridges, heartily wished I might there end my days. I bemoaned my desolate widow and fatherless children. I lamented my own folly and wilfulness. I attempting a second voyage against the advice of all my friends and relations. In this terrible agitation of mind I could not forbear thinking of Lilliput, whose inhabitants looked upon me as the greatest prodigy that ever appeared in the world, where I was able to draw an imperial feat in my hand, and perform those other actions which will be recorded forever in the chronicles of that empire, while posterity should hardly believe them, although attested by millions. I reflected what a mortification it must prove to me to appear as inconsiderable this nation as one single Lilliputian would be among us. But this, I conceived, was to be the least of my misfortunes, for as human creatures are observed to be more savage and cruel in proportions to their bulk, what could I expect but to be a morsel in the mouth of the first among these enormous barbarians that should happen to seize me? Undoubtedly philosophers are in the right when they tell us that nothing is great or little otherwise than by comparison. It might have pleased to let the fortune of the Lilliputians find some nation where the people were as diminutive with respect to them as they were to me, and who knows but that even this prodigious race of mortals might be equally overmatched in some distant part of the world, whereof we have no discovery. Scared and confounded as I was, I could not forbear going on these reflections, when one of the reapers, approaching within 10 yards of the ridge where I lay, made me apprehend that with the next step I should be squashed to death under his foot, or cut in two with his reaping hook. And therefore when he again was about to move, I screamed as loud as fear could make, whereupon the huge creature trod short, looking around under some him, and last espied me as I lay on the ground. He considered a while, with the caution of one who endeavours to lay on a small dangerous animal in such a manner that it shall not be able either to scratch or to bite him, as myself have sometimes gotten with the weasel in England. But at length he ventured to take me with the middle of his forefinger and thumb, and brought me within 3 yards of his eyes, that he might behold my shape more perfectly. I guessed his meaning, and my good fortune gave me so much presence of mind that I resolved not only to struggle in the least, as he held me in the air above 60 foot from the ground, although he grievously pinched my sides, for fear I should slip through his fingers. All I ventured was to raise my eyes towards the sun, and place my hands together in a supplicating posture, and to speak some words in a humble melancholy tone, suitable to the condition I then was in, for I apprehended every moment that he would dash me against the ground, as we usually would do to any hateful little animal we have the mind to destroy. But my good star would have it that he, pleased with my voice and gestures, began to look upon me with curiosity, much wondering to hear me pronounce articulate words, although he could not understand them. In the meantime I was not able to forbear groaning and shedding tears, and turning my head towards my sides, letting him know, as well as I could, how cruelly I was hurt by the pressures of the thumb and finger. He seemed to apprehend my meaning, for lifting up the lappet of his coat, he put me gently into it, and immediately ran along with me to his master, who was a substantial farmer, the same person I had first seen in the field. The farmer having, as I supposed by their talk, receiving such an account as me as a servant could give him, took a piece of a small straw, about a walking staff, there lifted upon the lappet of my coat, which he seemed to be some kind of covering that nature had given me. He blew my hairs aside to get a better view of my face. He called his hinds about him, and asked them, as I afterward learned, whether they had ever seen in the fields any little creature that resembled me. Then he placed me softly on the ground upon all fours. I immediately got up, walked slowly and backwards and forwards, till those people I had no intent to run away. They all sate down in a circle around me, to get a better observe of my motions. I pulled off my hat, and made a low bow to the farmer. I fell on my knees, and lifted my hands and eyes, spoke in several words as I could. I took a purse of gold out of my pocket, and humbly presented to him. He received it on the palm of his hand, and applied it close to his eye, to see what it was, and after turned it several times with the point of the pin, which he took out of his sleeve, but could make nothing of it. Whereupon I made a sign which he had placed on his hand on the ground. I took the purse, opened it, and poured the gold into his hand. There were 6 Spanish pieces of 4 pistoles, each, beside 20 or 30 smaller coins. I saw him wet the tip of his little finger upon his tongue, and take up one of my largest pieces, then another, but he seemed wholly ignorant what they were. He made me a sign to put them again into my purse. The purse was again into my pocket, which after several times, I thought it best to do. The farmer, by this time, was convinced I must be a rational creature, and often spoke to me, but the sound of his voice pierced my ears like that of a water-mill, yet his voice was articulate enough. I answered out loud as I could in several languages. He often laid his ear within 2 yards of me, but all in vain, for we were wholly unintelligible to each other. Then he sent one of his servants to their work, and taking his handkerchief out of his pocket, he doubled and spread it on the left of his hand, and placed flat on the ground, with the palms upward, making a sign to step into it, as I could easily do, for it was not but a foot in thickness. I thought it could my best part to obey, for the fear of falling, laid myself at the length of the handkerchief, and remainder of which he lapped me to the head for further security. In this manner he carried me home to his house. There he called his wife, and shewed me to her, but she screamed and ran back as women in England do at the sight of a toad or a spider. However, after a while she had seen my behaviour, and how well I observed the signs her husband made, she was soon reconciled, but the degree grew extremely tender to me. It was about 12 at noon, and the servant brought in dinner. It was only a substantial meat, fit for the plain condition of a husbandman, in a dish about 4 and 20 diameter. The company were a farmer and his wife, 3 children, and an old grandmother. When they were sat down, the farmer placed me at some distance from him on the table, which was 30 foot high from the floor. I was in a terrible fright, and kept as far as I could from the edge of the fear of falling. The wife minced a bit of meat, crumbled some bread on a trencher, and placed it before me. I made her a low bow, took out my knife and fork, and fell to eat, which gave them exceeding delight. The mistress sent her maid for a small dram cup, which held about 3 gallons, and filled it with drink. I took up the vessel with much difficulty in both hands, and in a most respectful manner drank to her ladyship health, expressing words as loud as I could in English, which made the company laugh so heartily that I was almost deafened with the noise. The liquor tasted like a small cider, and was not unpleasant. Then the master made me a sign to come to his trencher side, but I walked on the table, being in great surprise all the time, as the indulgent reader will easily conceive and excuse. I happened to stumble against the crust, and immediately fell flat to my safe, but received no hurt. I got up immediately, observing the good people to be in much concern. I took my hat out under my arm out of good manners, and waving it over my head, made me 3 huzzas to shew I had got no mischief by my fall. But advancing forwards towards my master, as I henceforth call him, his youngest son, who sate next to him, an arch boy of about 10 years old, took me up by the legs, held me so high in the air that I trembled every limb. But his father snatched me from him. At the same time he gave him a small box on the left ear, as it would have fell a European horse to the earth, ordering to be taken from the table, and being afraid the boy might owe me a spite, and well remembering how mischievous all children among us are to sparrows and rabbits, young kittens, puppy dogs. I fell on my knees, and pointing to the boy, made my master to understand, as well as I could, that I desired his son might be pardoned. His father complied, and the lad took his seat again, whereupon I went in and kissed his hand, which my master took, and made him stroke me gently. In the midst of dinner my mistress's favourite cat leaped into her lap. I heard a noise behind me, like that of a dozen weavers at work, and turning my head, I found it to proceed from the purring of this animal, who seemed 3 times larger than an ox, as I computed from her view of her head, as one of her paws, while the mistress was feeding and stroking her. The fierceness of this creature's countenance altogether disposed me, though I stood at the further end of the table, above 50 foot off, although my mistress held her fast for fear that she might give a spring, seize me in her talons. But it happened that there was no danger, for the cat took not least notice to notice me when my master placed me within 3 yards of her. As I was always been told, found by the true experience of my travels, that flying, or discovering the fear for fierce animal, is a certain way to make it pursue or attack you. I resolved this dangerous juncture to shew no matter of concern. I walked with intrepidity 5 or 6 times before the very head of the cat. She came within half a yard of her, whereupon she drew herself back, as if she was more afraid of me. I had less apprehension concerning the dogs, whereof 3 or 4 came into the room, as it is usual of the farmer's house, one which was a mastiff equal to bulk of 4 elephants, and a greyhound somewhat taller than a mastiff, but not so large. When dinner was almost done, the nurse came in with a child of a year old in her arms, who immediately spied me, and began to scold that you might hear from the London Bridge to Chelsea. The usual oratory of infant to get me for a plaything. The mother, out of pure indulgence, took me up, put me towards the child, who presently seized me in the middle, got my head in his mouth, where I roared so loudly that the urchin was frightened, and let me drop. I should have infallibly broke my neck if the mother had not held her apron under me, the nurse to quiet her babe, after the use of a rattle, which was a kind of hollow vessel filled with great stones, and fastened by cable to the child's waist. But all in vain. She was forced to apply the last remedy by giving it suck. I must confess no object ever disgusted me so that the sight of her monstrous breast. I cannot tell what to compare with, as so the curious reader has the ideal of the bulk, shape, and color. It stood prominent 6 foot, as it could not be less than 16 in circumference. The nipple was about half the bigness of my head, and the hue of both that and the dug so verified with the spots, pimples, and freckles, that nothing could appear more nauseous, for I had a near sight of her, sitting down more conveniently to give a suck, and I standing on the table. This made me reflect on the fair skins of our English ladies, who appeared so beautiful to us, only because they are of our size, and their defects are not to be seen but through a magnifying glass, where we find by experiments that the smoothest and whitest skins look rough and coarse, and ill-coloured. I remember when I was at Lilliput, and the complexions of those diminutive people appeared to me the fairest in the world. Talking upon this subject with a person of learning there, who was an intimate friend of mine, said that my face appeared much fairer and smoother when he looked upon me from the ground, than did at nearer view when I took him up in his hand, and brought him close, which he confessed at first was very shockingly sight. He could discover great holes in my skin, and the stumps of my beard were 10 times stronger than the bristles of a boar, and my complexion made up of several colours altogether and disagreeable. Although I must beg to say for myself that as fair as I'm fair as most of my sex in country, and very little sunburnt all my travels. On the other side, discoursing of the ladies in the Emperor's court, used to tell me one had freckles, the other had too wide a mouth, the third too large a nose, nothing of which I thought to be able to distinguish. I confess this reflection was obvious enough, which, however, I could not forbear, lest the reader might think those vast creatures were actually deformed, for I must do them justice to say they are a comely race of people, and particularly the features of my master's countenance, although he were but a farmer, when I beheld him from the height of 60 foot, appeared very well proportioned. When dinner was done, my master went out to his labourers, and, as I could discover by his voice and gesture, gave his wife a strict charge to take care of me. I was very much tired, and disposed to sleep, when my mistress perceiving, she put me in her own bed, covered me with a clean white handkerchief, but larger and coarser than the mainsail of man of war. I slept about 2 hours, and dreamed I was at home with my wife and children. But that aggravated my sorrows when I awaked and found myself alone in a vast room, between 200 or 300 foot wide, and about 200 foot high, lying in a bed 20 yards wide. My mistress was gone for her household affairs, and had locked me in. The bed was 8 yards from the floor. Some natural necessities required me to get down. I had not presumed to call, and if I had, it would have been in vain with such a voice as mine, so great a distance from the room where I lay to the kitchen where the family kept. While I was under these circumstances, 2 rats crept up the curtains, smelling backwards and forwards on the bed. One of them came up almost to my face, whereupon I rose in a fright, drew my handkerchief to defend myself. These horrible animals had the boldness to attack me on both sides. One of them held up his forefeet at my collar, but I had the good fortune to rip up his belly before he could do me any mischief. He fell down at my feet. The other, seeing the fate of his comrade, made of escape, but not one without one good wound on his back, which I gave him after he fled, made the blood trickling from him. And after this exploit, I walked gently to and fro on the bed, to recover my breath and loss of spirits. These creatures were the size of a large mastiff, but indefinitely more nimble and fierce, so that I had taken off my belt and went to sleep. I must have infallibly torn to pieces and devoured. I measured the tail of a dead rat, and found it to be 2 yards long, wanting an inch. But it went against my stomach to drag the carcass off the bed, where it still lay bleeding. I often observed that it still had some life, but with a strong slash from the cross of its neck I thoroughly dispatched it. Soon after my mistress came into the room, seeing me all bloody, took me up in her hand. I pointed to the dead rat, smiling and making other signs to make sure I was not hurt, whereat she was extremely rejoiced, calling the man to take up the dead rat with a pair of tongs, and throw it out the window. When she set me on the table, where I shew her my hanger all bloody, and wiping me on the lappet of my coat, returning to the scabbard, where I was pressed to do more one of a thing, and the other I could not do for me, and therefore endeavoured to make my mistress understand that I desired to sit down on the floor, which she had done. My bashfulness would not suffer me to express myself farther than pointing to the door, bowed me several times. The good woman with much difficulty last perceived what I would be at, taking me up in her hand, and walking into the garden, where she set me down, and I went on one side about 200 yards, beckoning her to not look or follow me. I hid myself in 2 leaves of sorrel, and there discharged the necessities of nature. I hope the gentle reader will excuse me for dwelling on these and the like particulars, where really however insignificant that they may appear to the growing vulgar minds, yet will certainly help a philosopher to enlarge his thoughts and imagination, and apply them to the benefits of public as well as private life, which was my sole design in presenting this other account of my travels to the world, wherein I have been chiefly studious of the truth, without affecting any ornaments of learning or of style. But the whole scene of this voyage made so strong an impression of my mind, and is so deeply fixed on my memory, that committing it to paper, I did not omit one material circumstance. However, upon a strict review, I blotted the several passages of less moment which was in my trifling first copy, for the fear of censured as tedious and trifling, whereof travellers are often, perhaps not without justice, accused.